Hello, I'm Susan Vida, Chief of the Music Division of the Library of Congress. I'd like to welcome you to one of 3 new lectures that we are pleased to add to the Library of Congress and American Musicological Society Lecture Series. Since 2008, we have partnered with the AMS to present select society members who have conducted exciting research in the Music Division's unique collections. These videos, along with those of past AMS lectures, are available to stream on the library's website, as well as the library's YouTube channel. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. J. Mackenzie Pierce to discuss Tadeusz Zygfryd Kassern's opera, The Anointed, a commission from the Koussevitzky Foundation. Dr. Pierce researches music of the 20th century with a main focus on the politics of culture in Eastern Europe. His current book project examines the generation of Polish and Polish-Jewish modernist composers whose lives were affected by World War II and the Holocaust. Dr. Pierce's research on and underperformed repertoires has led to collaborations with international scholarly communities and performers. He is Assistant Professor of Musicology and Faculty Associate of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And now, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Pierce and invite you to enjoy his presentation, Tadeusz Zygfryd Kassern's opera, The Anointed, the Koussevitzky Foundation and the Music of Holocaust Memory in the Early Cold War. Thank you for joining us.
My talk this morning is about the Polish-Jewish composer Tadeusz Zygfryd Kassern and his opera, The Anointed. The opera recounts the downfall of Shabbatai Tzvi, who was born in Ottoman Turkey, declared himself the Jewish Messiah in 1665, and gained immense popularity among worldwide Jewry, before he converted to Islam as movement fell apart. For Kassern, Shabbatai's story was no ordinary historical topic. He intended The Anointed to serve as a dramatico-musical monument, the first in the history of opera, to the fight of the Jewish nation for freedom, and as a Ghetto Uprising memorial. The opera would thus commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, during which Jewish fighting forces held off German deportations for nearly a month before they were brutally suppressed. Kassern felt compelled to commemorate the Ghetto Uprising in part because he had witnessed it at close quarters. He had been hiding in Warsaw when the uprising began, about a mile outside the ghetto's walls. By the time he began working on The Anointed in 1949, however, he had defected from communist Poland and was living in New York City. The Anointed was completed in 1951, making it among the earliest operas that memorialize the events now termed the Holocaust. Nonetheless, the work remains unpremiered, unpublished, unrecorded, and largely unknown to this day. Today, I will consider the constellation of circumstances that improbably allowed Kassern to complete the opera despite the barriers the project faced in both Poland and the United States. My main focus, however, will be on the literary and musical decisions through which Kassern turned the story of an early modern messianic claimant into a commemoration for the Ghetto Uprising. Central to this transformation was Kassern's engagement with the traces of Polish literary romanticism in his source material, which was a drama by the Polish Catholic playwright Jerzy Żuławski. Romanticism in Poland had played a significant role in creating a national identity that linked collective suffering with action on the nation's behalf. While these ideas had their roots in a 19th century discourse, one developed during a time of Polish statelessness, Kassern, I will suggest today, turns them to treat Jewish loss and uses them as a lens for grasping the heroic and ultimately doomed acts of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. In its recrafting of a familiar cultural paradigm, The Anointed can be situated within the context of an early moment of Holocaust commemoration. As scholars such as David Cesarani, Eric Sundquist, Tasha Diener, and Zoe Waxman, among many others, have argued, the early post-war years were a time of intense, often improvised exploration of Holocaust memory. At the time, now commonplace ideas, such as the primacy of survivor testimony, the centrality of bearing witness in Holocaust-themed works, and limits of representation of trauma had not been extensively explored. And indeed, The Anointed fits uncomfortably within present-day assumptions about Holocaust commemoration. It does not use a text drawn from testimony or memoirs, a common feature of later commemorative works, nor does it infer the possibility of immediate contact with historical materials or voices, a trait that the musicologist Amy Wlodarski has argued is a key aspect of musical witness to the Holocaust. What is more, by present-day standards, The Anointed commemorative intentions may seem rather opaque. The opera draws no explicit connections to the Holocaust in its libretto, which is set exclusively in 17th century Turkey. It does not bear a dedication to Holocaust victims or survivors. The only extant evidence that Kassern intended the work as a monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising comes from a draft letter he wrote in 1950 that is preserved among his papers. He does not seem to have ever publicly announced his commemorative intentions for the work. It was, however, not uncommon for early responses to the Holocaust, such as Kassern's, to be hidden in plain view, that is, obvious to audiences at the time, but lost on later observers, as scholars such as Barbara Molesky, Olga Gershenson, and James Loeffler have all explored. The complex status of the work's commemorative intentions do not undermine The Anointed's significance as an artistic response to the Holocaust. Rather, they invite us to explore the cultural and musical worlds that informed Kassern's commemorative stance. To do so today, I draw on a variety of archival sources from the Library of Congress and elsewhere. The files of the Koussevitzky Music Foundation, which commissioned the opera in 1949, as well as the papers of Serge Koussevitzky and Artur Rubinstein, provide details about Kassern's activities while he was composing it. An especially valuable source is a draft version of the libretto held by the Library of Congress, which sheds light on Kassern's revisions to his source material. These sources complement my research in Kassern's personal papers, which are held at the University of Warsaw Library, and also the archive of Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which provides some crucial information about Kassern's activities before he defected. First, from Limburg to New York. Zygfryd Kassern was born in 1904 to an acculturated Jewish family in the city of Limburg, then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, it's Lviv, Ukraine. At age 16, he chose to baptize, adding the Tadeusz to his name. He was trained in music at the local conservatory and later studied law in Poznan. So that's where Limburg is, and then he moved to Poznan. As an adult, he made his living as a lawyer working in the Polish Prosecutor's General Office in Poznan, but he was also a significant music critic in the city and an organizer of its musical life. His compositions from before World War II, most prominently his 1928 Concerto for Voice, follow a Szymanowski-inspired interest in late Romanticism, as well as an exploration of a more pared-down neoclassical style. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Kassern was evacuated as part of the prosecutor's office eastward to Lwów, which soon fell under Soviet rule. Just over a year later, in 1940, Kassern fled from Soviet occupation to the Nazi-controlled city of Krakow. He likely left Soviet-controlled territories as he feared that as a former Polish public servant, he would soon be deported for forced labor if he remained. As the scholar Violeta Koska has reconstructed, Kassern worked in Krakow for the publishing house Gebetner & Wolf and was also involved in selling chemicals there. Near the end of 1942, he was denounced to the Gestapo, which forced him to leave Krakow and flee to Warsaw. Here, he assumed the identity of his wife's brother-in-law, a forestry engineer who had been killed in the 1939 defense of Poland. It was thanks to this false identity that Kassern could remain living on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw, and ultimately to survive the Holocaust. When the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began, Kassern was living under a mile away from the ghetto and recalled watching the smoke rise from its walls. Despite these challenging conditions, he continued to compose. The war years saw him turn to early music, and especially what he described as the immeasurable simplicity and strength of expression of Gregorian chant. In addition to composing a Gregorian triptych and a Polish mass, which were both based on chant sources, he also began sketches for an opera based on Shabtai's life. All these sketches were, however, subsequently lost. Several months after the war concluded, Kassern left Poland for the United States to take a position as a cultural attaché at the Polish Consulate General in New York. While his fluency in English and his legal training likely gained him the post, a major factor in the decision was his hope of advancing the cause of Polish music in the U.S. Even as he engaged in the day-to-day affairs of the Polish consulate, he does not seem to have been particularly closely attuned to the rapid consolidation of communist power in Warsaw, nor to its consequences. His letters and reports suggest ways in which Poland's cultural officials could learn from American arts policy, a position that was somewhat out of touch with the growing anti-Western pressures affecting his colleagues in Warsaw. In fall 1948, Kassern's conviction that he could further Polish culture by working for the Polish state fell apart. He returned to the country for a visit in November and early December, but was struck by what he later described as Poland's rapid Sovietization and the consolidation of communist rule that had been carried out since the war's conclusion. He returned to the United States and defected, gaining political asylum. As a former diplomat of a communist state, however, he faced a number of difficulties in New York. He first encountered a period of financial and material precarity. Quote, "I had absolutely no security nor possibilities for work, not even as a music copyist," unquote, he explained to an acquaintance who was considering a similar path. Eventually, he found some measure of stability by teaching piano lessons at the 3rd Street Music School settlement and by lecturing at the New School. He also encountered problems concerning his immigration status, as well as the liability of his former affiliations with Communist Poland during the height of the Red Scare. His immigration travails were often attracted press attention, less because he was a composer and because he was one of the first, reports often say at the time, the first, Polish official to defect from the communist state. In 1955, he attempted suicide because his application for citizenship had been denied, an event which was covered by the press and serialized by the Associated Press. The publicity of the suicide attempt prompted Francis E. Walter, then the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee and primary sponsor of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952, to declare that he viewed Kassern not as, quote, a diplomat, but a former member of a red propaganda organization, unquote. In response, the main opponent of Walter's immigration legislation, the New York Senator Herbert Lehman, introduced a bill to grant Kassern and his wife, Lungina, lawful entry, although this never passed into law. In September 1956, the Kasserns were granted permanent visas, but Tadeusz died of cancer in May of the next year. The Anointed was thus composed during a time when Kassern's immigration status was murky, and when his role as a former official of a communist state was soon to become a liability. Part 2. The Politics of Holocaust Commemoration between Warsaw and New York. Kassern never stated if his decision to defect was motivated in part by the growing anti-Semitism of the post-war Polish state, and his personal views towards Jewishness are not documented. Nonetheless, circumstantial evidence suggests that his trip back to Poland also led him to rethink whether there was a future for Jewish culture in Poland. On the trip, he intended to secure an agreement to perform Arnold Schoenberg's A Survivor from Warsaw, touting the possibility of a performance in the National Philharmonic with one of Poland's star conductors. In Warsaw, Kassern was also offered an opera commission and proposed The Anointed. He described the rejection of this proposal in a 1950 letter to Julius Rudel, conductor and director of the 3rd Street Music School, who was himself a Jewish refugee from Nazism. Quote, "The Anointed has been conceived as a dramatical musical monument, the first in the history of opera, to the fight of the Jewish nation for freedom. The hero of my opera, the powerful great Kabbalist Shabbat Zvi, was the speaker of this fight in the 17th century. The idea of composing The Anointed, now being done to an English text, received a strong impetus during the war years, when being in Poland under the Nazi occupation, I witnessed the most inhuman tragedy that befell the Jewish nation. Since that time, the urge to contribute a musical monument to Jewish history never left me. After the war in Poland, I was offered a large commission to write an opera. I suggested The Anointed as a Ghetto Uprising memorial, but I was severely rebuked and forbidden to write this opera because the communist government considered it as favoring Jewish nationalistic tendencies, and this the communists strongly opposed. You will understand why I'm so deeply attached to writing and doing this work here in this free country." Unquote. It was not unreasonable for Kassern to have believed that Poland's Ministry of Culture would commission an opera about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Since shortly after the war concluded, the Communist Party had held up the Ghetto Uprising as one tenet of a broader struggle against fascism, while rewriting this history to claim that the uprising was led primarily by communists. The result was that, for a few brief years after the war, Jewish self-determination and communist politics were compatible, forming what the historian Marcy Shore has described as an aesthetics of Zionist socialist realism. Public celebrations of the Ghetto Uprising were a yearly occurrence in Poland, and the 5-year anniversary of the uprising in April 1948 was especially significant. Although Kassern was not privy to the discussions happening at party headquarters and in the Central Jewish Committee in Warsaw, who were responsible for organizing the anniversary, he could not have missed the public outcome of these efforts, the unveiling of Nathan Rappaport's Monument to the Ghetto Heroes, in an event that drew widespread national and international attention. The 1948 anniversary even featured musical events. There was a concert of Jewish orphans. There was also Leon Weiner's setting of a Yiddish translation of Władysław Broniewski's poem To the Polish Jews, and a cantata that underscored a message of common Polish and Jewish triumph against German brutality. Kassern's proposal in late 1948 for a Jewish-themed opera did not take into account, however, the dual-faced strategy around Jewishness of Poland's communist leadership, nor the rising tides of official anti-Semitism in the Eastern Bloc. To foreign audiences, Poland's leaders projected an image of tolerance for Jewish minority rights. Yet when speaking domestically, they thought to shore up their unpopular position among the country's now predominantly ethnic Polish population by invoking the ethno-nationalist rhetoric of Poland for the Poles. A significant part of Kassern's work in the United States was in fact geared towards projecting this former, more tolerant image of Poland towards an American and a Jewish American audience. He repeatedly defended Poles against accusations of anti-Semitism, especially after the Kielce pogrom on 4 July 1946. For example, he wrote to the renowned Polish Jewish pianist Artur Rubinstein in 1947, quote, "Please believe me that incriminating the entire country for the pogrom, and thus also musicians in Polish music, would be an injustice for them, just as one cannot hold an entire national or state community responsible for racial or national persecution anywhere on the entire globe." Unquote. At other times, Kassern assisted the Consul General spread such propaganda through talks in the U.S. that linked the memorialization of the Ghetto Uprising with Jewish resettlement in Western territories that Poland had regained from Germany. Gained, not regained. Kassern's proposal to the ministry in Warsaw for his Jewish-themed opera and a premiere of Schoenberg's A Survivor from Warsaw can be interpreted as an ill-fated attempt to continue his ongoing work at the Polish consulate, work that was dedicated to building an official narrative of post-war Polish Jewish tolerance. In the United States, where Kassern eventually completed the opera, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was also a topic of considerable popular attention. Many parts of American Jewry had turned to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a prominent topic in early Holocaust commemorations, often treating the uprising an example of a heroic or muscular Jewishness. Non-Jewish audiences also had considerable interest in the uprising. For instance, a fictional account of the events by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Hersey, titled The Wall, rapidly climbed the bestseller lists in 1950, just as Kassern was composing The Anointed. Kassern's opera can also be read against a backdrop of the tightening Cold War pressures that he faced as an exile and former diplomat from a communist state. His portrayal of Szabatai as a freedom fighter against tyranny fit well with American rhetoric that painted the Western sphere of the Cold War as committed to values such as individual freedom and liberty. Indeed, Kassern grasped the need to perform this rhetoric rather well. In 1950, while working on The Anointed, he had also composed a Freedom Polonaise, which was performed under the auspices of the National Committee for Free Europe, a major anti-communist organization of the era. The institutional support for completing the opera in the United States came from Serge Koussevitzky, one of the most significant figures in American new music at the time. He had fled the Russian Revolution and eventually established himself in the United States during the 1920s as one of the country's star symphonic conductors and a fervent promoter of new compositions. He had also often served as an informal patron to immigrant composers from Russia and Eastern Europe, and to some degree he took on this role with Kassern too. The commission for The Anointed, awarded by the Koussevitzky Music Foundation in May 1949, was Kassern's first major award in the United States, and the opera would be his first work after defecting. Following Koussevitzky's death in 1951, the foundation continued to try to help Kassern secure a premiere for the work, but with no success. Part 3. Nationalizing the Messiah. Even before the Holocaust, Kassern believed that Jerzy Żuławski's play about Shabbatai, Koniec Messiasza, The Messiah's Demise, would lend itself to operatic treatment. In 1937, he had suggested that The Messiah's Demise would make for a promising opera thanks to its exotic setting and strong expression. His early interest in the exotic certainly appears in the final opera. He calls, for instance, for an opulent staging of the Ottoman court in Act II, complete with large groups of dancers and slaves who entertain the Sultan. This is a staging that certainly reflects an Orientalist attitude common among Polish composers in the 1930s. Yet his libretto also drew on and helped contribute to a view of Shabbatai that saw the Messiahs connecting Jewish nationhood, trauma, and Messianism in ways that afforded longer-reaching metaphors for Jewish identity. An overview of the historical Shabbatai's life and the Sabbatian movement are in order. Born in 1626 in Smyrna, Shabbatai's early days were consumed with scholarship of the mystical Kabbalistic tradition. Although his first messianic inclinations date from about 1648, he publicly declared himself the Messiah in May 1665. With incredible speed, a full-blown messianic awakening was underway by late 1665 in Palestine and Egypt, and quickly spread, largely through letters and rumors, across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and Europe. The resulting movement would become, according to the historian Matt Goldish, quote, the most widespread and influential Jewish messianic movement since Christianity, unquote. Yes, yet just as quickly as the Sabbatian movement took off, it began to fray. Shabbatai had been taken before the Ottoman authorities in 1666 and interrogated about his activities. A physician at the court, an apostate Jew, suggested that he could save himself from punishment if he converted to Islam. Surprisingly, perhaps given his messianic intentions, Shabbatai chose this path, and he was given a title and a stipend after so doing. The conversion did not immediately end his movement, however, and significant groups of Sabbatian followers continued to believe in the Messiah and his ideas for years after his demise. Jewish commentators had engaged with the legacy of Shabbatai throughout the 19th and earliest 20th centuries, finding a diverse set of lessons in his movements concerning topics such as conversion, modernity, and even Zionism. One result was that by the early 20th century, as Jacob Barney has explained, almost every significant Jewish or Hebrew poet had either written about Shabbatai or had taken part in a literary project that engaged with the subject. Although Żuławski was not himself Jewish and did not really share the concerns about Jewish politics that drove many commentators to reflect on Shabbatai, he had considerable interest in Jewish history and religion. He was especially drawn towards Jewish mysticism, a history in which Shabbatai played an important role. This interest was spurred in part by his friendship with the writer Misha Joseph Berdichevsky, but the most direct model for the Messiah's demise was the drama penned by Sholem Asch in 1908, which Żuławski read in a German-language version, not the original Yiddish. Żuławski filtered the Shabbatai story through his own literary sensibilities, and especially through his ongoing engagement with the legacy of Polish Romanticism. Broadly speaking, Polish Romanticism had responded to the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the late 18th century, and the failure of the 1830 November Uprising to regain Polish sovereignty, through what the literary scholar Stanley Bill has described as, quote, a poetic rationalization of political weakness, unquote. A core belief of Polish Romantic poets was that the suffering of the Polish nation had turned partitioned Poland into the Christ of nations. Much like Jesus' sacrifice was needed for the redemption of individuals, so too was Poland's sacrifice needed for a collective and terrestrial salvation of mankind, as the historian Andrzej Walicki has discussed. Polish Messianism, as this doctrine is called, was a deeply utopian and radical view, yet among Poland's gentry and intelligentsia, it was instrumental in forging a political identity that stressed heroic self-sacrifice on the nation's behalf. Although the political force of Romanticism and Messianism had been blunted by the failures of the 1848 Springtime of Peoples and later the 1863 January Uprising, Romantic ideals continued to shape conceptions of Polish identity in Żuławski's time. His writings leading up to the Messiah's demise reveal a keen interest in exploring the limitations of Romanticism and the political acts it engendered. For instance, his theatrical debut in 1902, The Dictator, on the left, paints Marian Langiewicz, who was a leader of the January Uprising, in an unsympathetic light, suggesting that he was driven more by personal ambition than concern for national cause. Romantic tropes of Messianism and Uprising also appear in the more fantastical context of Żuławski's best-known work, his science fiction books, The Lunar Trilogy. Given his ongoing probings of the Polish national and romantic project, it is not difficult to interpret The Messiah's Demise, published in 1911, as a continuation of these themes. In this reading, the Jewish Messiah is a stand-in for Polish Messianism, and Shabtai's failure to liberate the Jewish people is a thinly veiled allegory for the failure of the Polish romantic messianic ideal to, in fact, free Poles from foreign rule. The Messiah's Demise could thus be read as one chapter in a long history of Polish romantic appropriations of Jewish history to clarify the stakes of Polish national politics. These potential allegorical readings aside, Żuławski has written the character of Shabtai so that he espouses key themes of Polish Romanticism. Throughout, the play suggests that the suffering of the Jewish nation is the key factor in Shabtai's rise to power. It was not unprecedented to connect the Sabbatean movement to bloodshed, especially to the Khmelnytsky Uprising, which saw some of the largest mass murders of Jews in Eastern Europe prior to the Holocaust. Asch's version of the play, on which Żuławski had drawn heavily, had done this too, but Żuławski goes further by treating Jewish suffering as the driving force behind Shabtai's power. When Żuławski Shabtai first confronts the Sultan, for instance, he explains how his wardrobe conveys both national glory and pain. He speaks, "Sultan, you saw me in my royal attire. This is the power, magnificence, and glory of my nation. But this painful hair shirt is woven from deprivation, from the tears, the suffering, and the humiliation of my children. This is my own fate." Unquote. Throughout the play, Shabtai is one who suffers through the hair shirt, self-flagellation, and asceticism on behalf of his people. This transference of collective suffering onto the individual makes him a figure who is both national and Christ-like, a key trope of Polish romantic messianism. A second major romantic trope that Żuławski brings to the play is the conflict between the hero and God. Żuławski paints Shabtai as not only speaking on the nation's behalf, but even rebelling against God in his attempts to liberate the Jewish people. As he proclaims when praying to God, quote, "I told you about the deprivation of the people that you, after all, call your own. I told you of the sword of the enemy and the knife of the robber, of indignity, disdain, and dishonor, but you were silent." Unquote. Shabtai explains that this silence is what has led him to take the mantle of God on earth. "Forgive me that since I was unable to wait for your sign, I made myself the Redeemer." Unquote. Shabtai's stance here resembles that of one of the most famous romantic heroes in Polish literature, Konrad from Adam Mickiewicz's Jady Part 3. Like Shabtai, Konrad challenges God while speaking on behalf of the nation. A prominent line is, quote, "I challenge thee, I and a nation's mighty heart are one." Quote. Konrad even calls God the Tsar and, rather than father of the people, an idea that Żuławski has Shabtai echo almost directly. These themes are tellingly absent from Asch's version of the play, which suggests that their addition represents Żuławski's own literary priorities. Żuławski's play ultimately brings into focus the limits of this Polish messianic vision of the national redeemer. Although Shabtai has become a Christ-like figure who suffers for the redemption of the collective nation, he actually fails to provide this liberation. The portrayal of failure, which Żuławski centers in the very title of the play, The Messiah's Demise, is also a marked departure from Ash. For Ash, Szabtaj's downfall is precipitated when he chooses the worldly fame and power that his movement has unleashed under the devotion to the divine word. In Żuławski's version, by comparison, two main causes are foregrounded. The first is Szabtaj's carnal weakness, as indicated by his inability to keep his vows of chastity. The second is that his project of worldly salvation simply lacks divine support. One detects an undercurrent of inevitability through Szabtaj's failure in Żuławski's version that suggests a weakness in the larger Polish messianic project. The Christ-like national freedom fighter cannot bring about worldly redemption without a change in broader conditions outside that hero's control. Nonetheless, not all hope for freedom is foreclosed, and the play ends with lines that promise an eventual rise of a true Messiah. Part 4. Kassern's musical monument. What is particularly intriguing about The Anointed is how Kassern did not remove the romantic and Polish nationalist veneer that Żuławski had applied to the Szabtaj story. Instead, his changes strengthen the romantic linkages between trauma, nation, and rebellion in the play, even as the nation under question has clearly become the Jewish rather than the Polish one. This raises the intriguing possibility that he found in the Polish Romantic legacy a symbolic language with which to grapple with the experiences of the Holocaust and Jewish resistance. The opening of the opera presents a generalized context of Jewish suffering, free from references to 17th century events, which reinforces a sense of longer national continuities. The first scene of Żuławski's The Messiah's Demise had highlighted the international reach of the movement. It opens with dialogues between Jews from Spain, Amsterdam, and Poland, all of whom discuss the plights of their respective communities. In a draft of the libretto for The Anointed, Kassern had preserved this idea, but for the final version, these distinct national voices have been eliminated. Instead, the opera opens with a chorus of the Jewish people whose specific temporal and cultural placement is left undefined. To be sure, this rewriting helps to simplify the narrative and focus audience attention on the main plot, but it also undermines the grounding of Szabtaj's movement in historical circumstances of the 17th century, suggesting that the forces shaping his movement exceed their early modern context. The opening chorus of Suffering Jews is also significant because it connects The Anointed to other canonic operas that included similar choruses, usually of enslaved Jews from biblical times. Saint-Saëns' Samson and Delilah opens with such a chorus, and Verdi's Va Pensiero from the opera Nabucco is another prominent example. The Verdi chorus, which is one of his most famous numbers, is especially striking because this chorus had become a stand-in for Italian national unification under the Risorgimento. It thus offers an early precedent for the linkage of ancient Jewish suffering to a more contemporary national cause, much like Kassern hoped to pursue here. In Kassern's version, the staggered choral entrances in the opening, when different parts of the chorus enter in different meters against a repeating three-note cycle in the orchestra, helps paint the Jewish people as a mass crying for help. While it might seem at first that his decontextualization of Jewish suffering in the opening chorus could allow listeners to more easily view the opera as an allegory for the Holocaust, it could equally be heard as painting a trans-historical narrative of Jewish suffering, that stretches from biblical times, as in Verdi and Saint-Saëns, onward. Some of Kassern's most intriguing deviations from his source material concern the reasons for Szabtaj's downfall, explored in Act 3. In Żuławski's The Messiah's Demise, Szabtaj loses his messianic powers after making love with his wife Sarah for the first time. It is somewhat unclear in the play if this lovemaking is merely a confirmation of his non-messianic status, or if it in fact triggers the downfall. He had already doubted parts of his messianic mission before and challenged God's authority. Nonetheless, Żuławski also suggests that carnal love is at fault. He paints Sarah in a quasi-heretical light, tempting Szabtaj with promises of a better life and happier life, while also doubting the sincerity of his messianic calling. Kassern's adaptation of the play preserves many of Szabtaj's doubts about his messianic mission, while significantly changing the role of his wife, who's now been renamed Miriam instead of Sarah, and changing the role that she plays in his downfall. In Shabtai's monologue at the start of Act 3, he asks for God's forgiveness for having made him myself a savior in the absence of an answer from thee. As the solo unfolds, he interprets the lightning bolts that the day before had prevented the Sultan from shooting arrows at him as an act of God that aimed to thwart his own claims to divine power. Next, and crucially for the interpretation of the scene of lovemaking that follows, Shabtai implores God not to tempt him with images of a happy life or with a reminder that there is such a thing as love. These lines set up the entrance of Miriam as a divine sign that would seem to confirm rather than precipitate Shabtai's demise. Indeed, when he falls for her, he enters a kind of trance in which he is bewildered and hypnotized, according to the stage directions, repeating her name and saying how beautiful she is before the two make love. We will now listen to Shabtai's monologue, which directly precedes Miriam's entrance.
soft green of fields and the murmur of waves, with the fragrance of herbs on a spring
Further heightening the sense of inevitability behind Shabtai's demise, Kassern rewrites the role of Miriam, his wife, to minimize her heretical and seductive tendencies. He cuts an entire dialogue from the play, in which she questions Shabtai's messianic calling. Moreover, in the dialogue before they make love, Kassern softens the moments when she questions his calling or suggests that he should embrace a life of happiness. We know that Kassern thought carefully about these moments because he made these cuts when revising a draft of the libretto into the final version. Compare these passages The first of which I'll note is also very close to the Żuławski source material. So in this first one, you can see he cuts an entire passage about how, in which Miriam expressed that Shabtai has suffered too much, that you're exposing yourself to near certain death, and also suggests that the messianic calling is just a ridiculous illusion, a sheer folly. He makes similar cuts again, where he cuts an entire passage where Miriam suggests that she herself is better than God, deeply heretical view, and that she'll give him happiness forever. And then he also makes some changes here, where the final couple of lines suggest a sort of doubt on the wife's part in the original version about the aims of his suffering, right? That you would have lost your mind. You would be happy if you came with me. Kassern takes those out. The result of all of these changes is that she becomes less of an active agent in his downfall and something like a divine vessel for the inevitable. It's also significant the changes that he makes after their downfall, so after the two wake up from making love the next morning. You notice here that in the original Żuławski version and in the draft of the libretto, Kassern has Shabtai blaming Miriam for what's happened. What have you done? Whereas in the final version that he writes, he directs it inwards. What have I done? Right? I was chaste, I was strong, now I've fallen. As these lines suggest, Kassern does not entirely remove the suggestion that Shabtai's downfall was caused by sin or by carnal love. Indeed, in the final act of the opera, Shabtai proclaims to his followers that, quote, God has not anointed me, through sin have I lost salvation, quote. Yet an audience who had attentively followed Act 3 would have understood a certain amount of ambiguity behind this statement, that this kind of claim was perhaps a public-facing one to his followers that downplays the conflict between the romantic redeemer and divine silence that had been at the center of the previous act. I would suggest that these changes, these revisions, show Kassern reworking his source material in light of the challenges posed by crafting a memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Żuławski's suggestion that Shabtai has fallen because of a personal shortcoming fit well with an agenda of critiquing 19th century Romanticism. But it sits awkwardly with the realities of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was defeated not because of deficiencies in individual acts, but because of this impossible task of resistance in the ghetto. The destiny of Kassern Shabtai, in comparison to Żuławski's, is determined by divine forces he cannot control or that even speak to him. He's defeated despite his best intentions and actions. Finally, Kassern's revisions at the opera's conclusion, as well as his musical setting of these portions, tempers the pessimism of Żuławski's play and focuses it on the themes of national unification and liberation. In Żuławski's The Messiah's Demise, as an Auschwitz play, a prophet announces that a true Messiah will eventually arrive after Shabtai's downfall. Kassern removes this theological message and replaces it with a statement focused on the Jewish people's eventual liberation. The day will come, the day of our freedom. The chorus takes up these words and sings them in a triumphant F major. You see here. After some detours, which I'll discuss shortly, this same key of F major reappears to conclude the opera, as you can see in the bottom of the screen. The concluding recall of a key area that had been associated with the Jewish proclamations of future freedom suggests that the Jewish people will eventually triumph, albeit perhaps beyond the plot of the opera itself. The music of the opera's conclusion also brings clarity to Miriam's role in Shabtai's downfall. After the chorus sings of the Jews' coming freedom, Miriam reappears on stage, which prompts the orchestra to return to dissonant harmonies. While standing over the collapsed Shabtai, she intones in Sprechstimme the final lines of the opera, "At last, mine," while the orchestra plays dissonant chord-like clusters. And you can see this at the very top of the screen here. The text would seem to emphasize her vindication of having Shabtai for herself, but the music paints a somewhat different story. Her vocal line concludes with a descent from the note G to F, thus calling the ear the F major key that had earlier indicated Jewish freedom. 2 measures later, the orchestra arrives on fortissimo F major chords and the opera concludes. Miriam's voice could thus be heard as joining this triumphant conclusion, her direct declaration that Shabtai is mine becoming consonant with the larger arc of eventual Jewish freedom that this key indicates. Musically, at least, Miriam's envelopment in F major and the opera's conclusion in this key suggests that her carnal love for Shabtai, and more generally his failure to achieve freedom for his followers, has been subsumed into a longer, ultimately hopeful future for the Jewish people. It is not for me to consider whether the ideologies of Romanticism, developed in response to 19th century Polish political losses that do not approach the terror and the trauma of the Holocaust, are capable of supporting the weight that Kassern asks them to bear in this opera. What is clear, however, is that Kassern's vision of his Ghetto memorial reflected his own multiple debts to Jewish, Polish, and American cultures. As an acculturated Jew deeply committed to Polish culture, he understood the political and cultural legacy of Romanticism. And he also used these ideas to shape a monument that centered and celebrated Jewishness, a religion he himself had once renounced. The Polish romantic tinge of the operatic narrative might seem to bring the work into the orbit of universalizing language of Holocaust commemoration, which was rather common in post-war Poland. These commemorations tended to downplay Jewish experience while folding them into a more general narrative of anti-fascist resistance. Yet Kassern emphatically insists on a representation of Jewish particularity. At the same time, the romantic vision, with its emphasis on freedom and self-determination, fits surprisingly well with the Cold War discourses Kassern encountered in America. The work's cross-cultural accrual reminds us of the multiple identities of Holocaust survivors and of the complex paths that musical works and literary symbols could travel along with them. In the years following the completion of The Anointed, Kassern continued to compose numerous works, including 2 operas. His 1952 opera, Sun Up, which he described as an American folk opera, even saw a premiere and favorable reviews in the New York Times. While Kassern's later works touched on a number of themes, he did not abandon his interest in Holocaust commemoration either. In the mid-1950s, he began sketches for an opera based on another of Żuławski's plays, Eros and Psyche. In Kassern's retelling of the myth, the forces of good and evil are reincarnated in conflicts in classical Greece, the French Revolution, Auschwitz, and Moscow's Lubyanka prison. These last 2 stages are especially important because they suggest that he saw the Holocaust as one step in a larger history, one in which Nazi and Soviet crimes could be equated. This, of course, fits well enough with the anti-communist era of the 1950s United States, as well as with his own experience of both Nazi and Soviet oppression during World War II. Yet it also resonates with Kassern's larger project that we have been exploring, in which the Holocaust is refracted through historical precedents and melded into larger narratives of continuity and rupture. Unfortunately, we do not know how Kassern might have realized this opera. It remained unfinished when he died in 1956 at the age of 53. Thank you.